understand here that, okay, we get the fact that they're done with Russia. Now, this century, they're focusing on Muslim world to disintegrate that. And after 9/11, they're done with Afghanistan, they're done with Iraq, Egypt is done. Now, it's Syria's turn. So, what's the ultimate goal? What do they want?
See, Syria is again, the 6 objectives that we defined. Let's pick them one by one. By destroying Iraq, by destroying Syria, by destroying Egypt, basically what they do is all major countries which were on the neighborhood of Israel are destroyed, dismantled, they're broken down into smaller, dysfunctional, headless, failed states, meaning thereby they are not a threat to the state of Israel, which is a nuclear armed weapon state. You see, what the Americans have is 3 strategies in front of them to achieve the objectives which they want. One is called the Somalia strategy. The Somalia strategy is you go into a country, you destroy it, you come out and leave the country in a mess, a headless, dysfunctional, failed state. Americans went into Somalia in the early 90s, destroyed it, came out, and now Somalia today is a functional example of how failed states work. And this is one strategy what the Americans have. They go in, they destroy the country, they come out, make a mess of it. The second strategy which the Americans are deploying is called the Iraq strategy, in which they go and occupy the land. They invaded Iraq, they occupied the land, they're present there, and then by being there, they exploit the ethnic and religious divides between Shias and Sunnis, between Arabs and Kurds, divide the country further by being there.
They keep them busy in their internal problems, so those countries cannot stabilize.
And functionally, Iraq is a headless state even today. It's almost divided into 3 major segments. Kurdistan is separate, Sunni Iraq and Shia Iraq is almost divided, and they're fighting amongst each other, and the presence of the Americans or the puppet regime on top is just to make sure that Iraq stays like this. Despite the fact that there's no high intensity conflict going on in Iraq, Iraq remains in a state of urban, decentralized, asymmetric war. 30 or 40, almost you can say dozens of suicide bombings takes place every week, every month. Hundreds of people are killed every month. And Iraq is in a mess. The world's largest oil producing country does not have oil for its people. The people are absolutely destroyed. This is called the urban 4th generation war. This is the kind of war which they are waging in the Muslim world now. That's the second option.
So they did this to Iraq. So you're saying that the biggest, largest oil producing country is in its internal mess. Let's come to Afghanistan. What's going to happen there? They are evacuating in 2014. NATO allies would be leaving that land, Afghanistan. So what do you see is going to happen there?
Before I come to this, just need to conclude. The third option that the Americans plan to do with various Muslim countries is called the Yugoslavia option. You see what they did in Yugoslavia, 1992 and 95, the last century. Yugoslavia was largest pro-Soviet Union country in the heart of Europe. But within 3 years, Yugoslavia disintegrated into 5 or 6 different countries. What happened? Americans ignited ethnic wars, religious wars in Yugoslavia. And after 3 years, NATO went in. They bombed Yugoslavia back to Stone Age, forced the combatants to on a table, and signed the Dayton Peace Agreement, which basically decided the fate of Yugoslavia, broke down Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia does not exist as a state, as a nation, as a country anymore, and divided into multiple Kosovo, Bosnia, Croatia, Montenegro, different countries, Serbia.
Right.
It's divided. So these 3 options that the Americans would use in every Muslim land, either it's going to be Somalia option or Iraq option or Yugoslavia option. So in Afghanistan, which you're saying now, what Americans did is they went in. But there's a difference between Iraq and Afghanistan. In Iraq, they did not find that much of a resistance which they are finding in Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been a graveyard of empires for centuries. Alexander couldn't control it. British Empire couldn't control it. Soviets couldn't control it. Americans wouldn't be able to control it, and they have not been able to. And now the Indians are planning to go, and we welcome them there, because it's been a long time. We have not seen a graveyard of Indian empire somewhere.
They will get beaten up bad. I hope so.
We are looking forward to that.
Right.
So, but the point is that Americans have been defeated in Afghanistan. They have to evacuate. But keep one thing in mind. They evacuated from Somalia also. But what did they leave behind? A mess. And this is exactly what the Americans plan to leave in Afghanistan also. Exploiting the ethnic frictions between Pashtuns and Tajiks and Uzbeks and Hazaras, Americans would first try to convince the minority communities of Uzbeks and Tajiks and Hazaras that you need us, you need the American presence in Afghanistan to protect you against Pakistan-backed Taliban. This is the pitch that they are going to sell first. And if it works, Americans will leave a rear guard behind. A small force would remain in Afghanistan. But if this pitch doesn't work, if the Uzbeks and Tajiks say, no, we don't want foreign forces, we'll settle our scores with the Pashtun Taliban, their own countrymen, we will find some way to coexist with them, then the Americans will be forced to leave Afghanistan. But before that, they do that, all their military hardware, all their weapons, all their ammunition, all their equipment will be distributed within different ethnic communities, ethnic groups, warlords, gangs, terrorist groups in Pakistan. It will actually be distributed. And this is what is happening. Americans on paper are saying that they are leaving behind $37 billion worth of military hardware, which will be destroyed according to them. Basically means no record. All records will be
distributed.
That will be distributed
among all those
all the militant groups in the entire region. So when the Americans leave, the country becomes...
Then Zahid Hamid Sahib, isn't it better that everybody should have a peace talk, and these people within Afghanistan and Pakistan, they can have, you know, peace talks with each other? And if they can get the unity among themselves, then a third factor can exploit them.
The solutions are many. This is something that Pakistan, Iran, Turkey and Afghan groups have to sit, and China and Russia, of course, have to sit together. And we have to decide that the mess that the Americans are leaving within the heartland of Central Asia, which is not just a Muslim heartland, a heartland of Central Asia also, which affects China and Russia directly as well. So this is something that is of interest, great interest of all these neighboring regional countries, and they have to take charge of the destiny of Afghanistan to decide what kind of future Afghanistan should have. Should be a peaceful future, should be a future which should not be spreading violence and terrorism into the entire, from Central Asia, from Chinese Turkestan to Central Asia to Iran to Pakistan. No country in the region wants terrorism to emerge out of Afghanistan. But when the Americans leave, you can be sure they are going to leave behind a bloody mess. And this is something that the Americans are planning now. This is exactly what they're doing in Pakistan. All the insurgent and terrorist groups in Pakistan are using NATO weapons. They are using NATO-supplied weapons. And so this is something that Pakistan Army has officially acknowledged. Pakistan's ministries and government departments have officially acknowledged. The terrorists that have been captured are found to be using NATO weapons, and we know
Let me take a break here, Zahid Hamid, from where we left.
You see, Syria is a very interesting case in the Middle East, and a genuine crisis for the Crusaders, if I use the word. But this is the word that the Bush used when they launched this world war after 9/11. He actually used the word that crusade would now be launched within the Muslim world. And it was not an accidental slippage of tongue. They actually meant it. Syria, again, as we said, is an extremely interesting case. There's another term that we'd like to introduce here that's called Pipelinistan. Pipelinistan. All the Muslim lands are normally called Istan in the end. Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Pakistan, you see. So from there they have coined a new term, Pipelinistan. A country, a land from where the pipelines would pass. And interestingly, all energy, oil and gas pipelines pass through Muslim lands. And when Russia wants to export gas to Europe, which is a $500 billion per year market, we are talking about big money here. We are talking about huge future potential of who controls Europe's fuel energy market. And every gas pipeline which these regions want to push to Europe goes through Syria. That makes Syria very interesting. The Russian firm Gazprom, which had already signed agreements and deals with Syrian government to push gas pipelines into Turkey and from Turkey to Europe, is obviously offended by the fact that the Western powers, Saudis, Qataris, they want to replace Gazprom with a government in Syria which would be pro-Saudis, pro-Qataris and pro-West and pro-Israel. And this is actually the reason for conflict in Syria. It's a war for pipelines.
It's the war for pipelines. So I need to know, Zahid Hamid Sahib, what's the catch for Russia in supporting Syria? And what's the catch for China in supporting Syria?
You see, this is the point what we are saying.
And then what's the problem of Saudi with Syria?
You see, the problem is, it's a very complex ground situation which is being exploited by global and regional powers. These Russians want to push their gas pipeline through Syria. Iranians want to push their gas pipeline through Syria. Fine enough. But Saudis and Qataris also want to push their gas pipeline through Syria. Israel does not have a gas pipeline going through Syria to Europe. Israel has its own independent gas reserves found in the Mediterranean, which they want to sell to the European market as well, but they can take it through the sea. They don't need Syria. So Israel does not want any country to use the Syrian land. Israel does not want Russia, Israel does not want Iran or Qatar or even Saudi Arabia to push their gas lines through Syria. So in Israel's interest, it is that Syria must remain in turmoil, must remain in chaos, must remain dismembered, broken down in a state of civil war. So no country can benefit from Syria, while Israel can push its gas pipeline to Europe, $500 billion per year market. And Israel in the process gains land, it will expand its borders, it will extend its territory, and at the same time remove a major threat of a Muslim country in its neighborhood like Syria, because Syria in the past has been a major problem for Israelis. No war in the Middle East could be fought without the Syrian contribution, and now when Syria itself is in a civil war, Israel is the net beneficiary. All other countries want friendly governments in Damascus. Russia wants Bashar al-Assad to stay, Iran wants Bashar al-Assad to stay, Qataris and Saudis want Bashar al-Assad to go, and a Sunni government come. Interestingly, Bashar is Shia also. And this makes the war gives a sectarian dimension as well. The sectarian wars within the Muslim world...
When we have approached the Bashar al-Assad's regime, I want to know that how was his regime? How was he, as a leader of Syria?
Bashar, Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi were Baathists. They're all communists, they're all seculars, liberals, pro-Russians, and actually anti-Islamic. And all of them have been very secular, very harsh, very brutal regimes who have been killing their own citizens. There have been no permission for dissent, no permission for difference of opinion. Actually, they are brutal regimes. There is no doubt about that.
So that's how the civil war began in Syria, due to Bashar al-Assad's strict regime?
It's not just that. You see, again, please try to understand. Saddam Hussein was a brutal man. There's no doubt about this. He was a cruel man. He was a very, very harsh and brutal dictator and a secular and a pro-Russian. But when he exploited on the sectarian Shia-Sunni card, and he was given full backing by the West and the Saudis to stop the Iranian revolution. For 10 years, Iraq fought against Iran in the Iran-Iraq Gulf War, which actually ignited the sectarian wars in the entire Muslim world. At that time, Saddam Hussein was an ally, a friend of the West, of the Americans. After the Iran-Iraq war, when Saddam became so strong, so became arrogant, so became powerful, that he annexed Kuwait as well, assuming that now he can do it and the Americans will back him up. That backfired completely. Then the Saudis and the Americans actually joined to destroy him in the first Gulf War and later on in the second Gulf War, and ultimately hanged him. So this geopolitics is complex. Sometimes a same dictator can be a very useful idiot for the Americans, and then when his retirement program starts, he is normally
hanged. He becomes a threat to them. And that's when they destroy them.
Well, we call them the CIA's retirement program. So when they use it, when they use a useful idiot, when his useful life is done, when his shelf life is over, they either hang him or kill him, just like they killed Gaddafi as well.
Okay. So now we are hearing that U.S. is providing weapons to the rebels in Syria. So they are pumping those rebels in Syria against Bashar al-Assad.
Now you will understand. Okay, this is the Yugoslavia doctrine that the Americans are doing. Yugoslavia doctrine was supporting the insurgent groups, terrorist groups, militant groups, and make them fight against each other to weaken the regime so much that ultimately NATO and Americans would move in with a limited military strike and make the regime collapse. This is what they're about to do now, but they have not been able to do. They have just backed off a little. They were almost on the verge of going to attack Syria, but they stopped at the last second because of a very harsh stand by Russia. Because you see, Gazprom...
So that's what I want to know, that don't you think that now things have slightly changed? It might not be that easy for US or UK to go ahead and have military strikes on any Muslim world.
This is for the first time that the Russian strategic interests have been so badly, so violently threatened. And the Gazprom, interestingly, also has, Mr. Putin, the president of Russia, also has his own personal shares in the Gazprom as well. So there's also personal vested interest involved as well. And if Gazprom deal is cancelled, if the Russians are not able to push their pipeline through Russia, if the regime is through Syria, and the regime is changed in Syria, that would mean for the entire 21st century, Russia would lose all its influence in the greater Muslim Middle East. All pro-Russian regimes have been destroyed. Saddam Hussein was pro-Russia, he was destroyed. Gaddafi was pro-Russia, he's been destroyed. Bashar al-Assad is the only Arab pro-Russian regime left.
So far.
And that has to be destroyed for the Americans, for the Israelis, and must be protected at all costs for the Russians. That's why this particular conflict has the ingredients to become a global war.
So we talked about Russia's interest in Syria. Now what's the catch of China? What's the interest of China in Syria? Why is he taking a stand for Syria?
It's basically an anti-American stand. It's basically energy. It's basically not giving too much strength to the American and the Western forces in the greater Muslim Middle East, which are the heartland of the world, not just the Muslims. As all the waterways go through it, all the gas and energy and the fuel fields are there, all the pipelines go through there. So that is itself a competition between the China and the Russia. And China also knows that whatever maneuvering that the Americans are doing in the world are actually not just to contain Russia or also to contain China. So you find a strategic alliance between Chinese and Russians over this issue, because Chinese also want to push their trading. The Silk Route always started from China and went to Europe.
So China has its economic interest as well. So we have two, Russia and China, vetoing in UN. We have two people there. Now third factor, third country, Iran, that is supporting Syria. What's the catch of Iran?
You see, Iran is on multiple axes. One is they're pro-Russians. They needed some superpower to be on their back when they were confronting the Americans and the West. Obviously, every small country wants another superpower, a neighborhood bully to be behind their back. And Russians and Chinese are two neighborhood bullies which Iran definitely wants to be in the back. Second is the Iran stance against the Saudis on the sectarian lines, on sectarian grounds. The same stance that we saw during the first Gulf War between Iran and Iraq, the same stance that we are seeing in Bahrain, the same stance that we are seeing in Yemen, the same stance that we are seeing now in Syria, that the government, the regime is pro-Iran Shia, and the opposition which is being supported, the rebels are being supported by Saudis. It's a sectarian divide also now. Basically, it all started on pipelines, all started on the protection of Israel, the grand strategic objectives that the US have defined for themselves. But to achieve those objectives, you need to play on the ethnic and sectarian axis. You need to exploit the sectarian divides, the ethnic divide, the linguistic divides, divide the Muslim world according to their terms on bloodlines. Kurdistan, Baluchistan, divide the Muslim world onto different communities also. So this is just one axis. Iran is involved in Syria not just because of its gas pipeline. Iran also has a gas pipeline which they need to push through, but also on sectarian lines.
On sectarian lines. And do you think that Iran also finds Syria as a belt, as a protective belt, in front of him, with Lebanon, Hezbollah's belt, and then Syria, and then it's Iran? So if Syria goes down, the next turn would be Iran. That's why it's supporting to have some protection line in front of him?
It's a very complex geopolitics. Saddam Hussein was an enemy of Iran. And when Saddam Hussein was fighting Iran, the entire Western world and Americans were supporting Saddam. But when Saddam became an enemy of the Americans, Iran actually sided and supported the Americans to bring down Saddam Hussein. So here you saw the Americans and Iran actually acting as allies against Saddam Hussein, a common threat, common enemy of both of them. So these geopolitics are really complex, because sometimes Iran actually seems to be against the Americans, but on certain axes, they actually cooperate with the Americans also when they have a common enemy between them. But as far as Syria is concerned, I personally have no doubt that once the Syrian regime is down, once the Syrian crisis is over, the next target would be Pakistan, not Iran. And there are many reasons to believe this, because Americans are simultaneously leaving Afghanistan also. Iran is not a nuclear weapon state. Pakistan is. Iran is a stable country right now. Pakistan is already in a state of anarchy. Iran is a hard nut to crack. Pakistan has become soft now because of a corrupt government, incompetent leadership, because of terrorism and violence that's going through in Pakistan, and because of the American presence in Afghanistan. They have an opportunity to. And in 1990, once the Soviet-Afghan war was over, Americans imposed sanctions on Pakistan. And I have personally no doubt that once the Americans do not need Pakistan for Afghanistan, for their supply lines and air routes that they're using now, sanctions would be imposed on Pakistan. Pakistan would be encircled. and Pakistan's nuclear program would be ruthlessly targeted. That's the last standing block left for the security and defense of Israel in the grand strategic objectives of US foreign policy.
Thank you very much.
Oded Yanon. Oded Yanon is the Israeli scholar who put forth the paper, A Strategy for Israel in the 1980s. And in that paper, it's a plan that's outlined to basically divide up the Arab world, and Iran too, I believe, into smaller states with the idea that smaller states are weaker states and therefore easier to dominate and control. The goal is divide and conquer. If people are pitted against each other and fighting each other, then they are basically, their attention is diverted, and it's easier for the empire power to take the resources and subjugate the people, and then you have colonialism.
Oded Yanon put forth such ideas that Israel should use its military power to destabilize and fragment Israel's enemies. This was put forth, as I said, in 1982 during the Begin administration, when, of course, Begin did invade Lebanon, and perhaps that was, though it failed, some historians have contended there was a broader plan intended there to affect more of the Middle East to advance Israeli security. I might say that the late Israel Shahak translated Yanon's study and into English, and the name of the translation was The Zionist Plan for the Middle East. Now, after 1996, the neoconservatives started to emphasize that the threat wasn't simply to Israel, but it was a threat to the United States, that there was a terrorist threat from the Islamic and Arab countries and groups in the Middle East, that the United States had to do something about it. The fundamental threat, they emphasized, came from Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Just want to point out that in both Yanon and Study and A Clean Break, there was an emphasis on attacking Iraq first, that Iraq was a key, let's say, a geostrategic location for Israel to destabilize all of its enemies in the Middle East.
So in this paper, there's basically, it was a right-wing proposal, but nevertheless, you see it coming to pass today with the proposal to divide Iraq into three parts, which is not what Iraqis want. The majority of Iraqis want the occupation to end. They want the restoration of Iraq.
Eastern Libya was where the Libyan Revolution began. The first protests on February 17th occurred here, the NTC was formed here, and it was the mission to protect Eastern Libyan civilians from Gaddafi's forces that gave the UN and NATO their justification for military intervention. This also happens to be where the majority of Libya's oil production takes place. Libya was divided into three provinces in the post-independence era, with the eastern province, known as Cyrenaica, hosting the country's economic capital in Benghazi. There remains a lot of nostalgia in the east that makes a return to that early system seem appealing. Certainly there are enough resources in eastern Libya for it to exist as a viable autonomous province.
تعودنا أن نقول فقط في سوريا، هذه المرة نقول فقط في دير الزور. عجز العالم، عجزت تركيا، عجز المسلمون، عجز العرب عن تحقيق منطقة عازلة لإيواء السوريين، فتم بحمد الله على يد المجاهدين من أبناء المنطقة كتائب لواء جعفر الطيار بتشكيل منطقة عازلة خاصة بهم.
I'm J.R. Church. Welcome to today's analysis of the news. Albert Pike was one of the most colorful characters in American history. It is said that he was born on December 29, 1809 in Boston, was the eldest son of 6 children born to Benjamin and Sarah Andrew Pike. He studied at Harvard and later served as Brigadier General of the Confederate Army. After the Civil War, Pike was found guilty of treason and jailed, only to be pardoned by President Andrew Jackson on April 2, 1866, who met with him the next day at the White House. On June 20th, 1867, Scottish Rite officials conferred upon Johnson 32nd degree Freemasonry degrees. Pike was said to be a genius, able to read and write 16 languages. He was one of the founding fathers of the head of the ancient accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, being the Grand Commander of North America Freemasonry from 1859, and retained that position until his death in 1891. In 1869, he was the top leader of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Pike was said to be a Satanist who indulged in the occult, and he apparently possessed a bracelet which he used to summon Lucifer, with whom he had constant communication. He was the Grand Master of a Luciferian group known as the Order of the Palladium, or of Sovereign Council of Wisdom, it's also been called, which had been founded in Paris in 1737. Now, General Albert Pike was the only Confederate general with a statue on federal property in Washington, D.C. He was honored not as a commander or even as a lawyer, but as Southern Regional Leader of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. The statue stands on a pedestal near the foot of Capitol Hill between the Department of Labor building and the Municipal building between 3rd and 4th Streets on D Street Northwest. Now, I tell you all of this because it is said that he received a vision from his mentor, Mr. Lucifer, I guess, on August 15th, 1871. And William Guy Carr, former intelligence officer in the Royal Canadian Navy, wrote a book called Satan, Prince of this World, in which he gives this information. He said that he received this information from a book written by Cardinal Caro Rodriguez in Santiago, Chile, who wrote in 1925 a book called The Mystery of Freemasonry Unveiled. And in this book, in 1925, it is said that he wrote a letter to a man named Mazzini in which he described this dream. And in the dream, he predicted 3 world wars. The First World War, he said, must be brought about, and I'm quoting from Albert Pike. The First World War must be brought about in order to permit the Illuminati to overthrow the power of the czars in Russia and of making that country a fortress of atheistic communism. The divergences caused by the agents of the Illuminati between the British and German empires will be used to foment this war. At the end of the war, communism will be built and used in order to destroy the other governments and in order to weaken the religions. Now, students of history will know that Otto von Bismarck forged certain alliances between 1871 and 1898, which brought about this war, this World War I. And Otto von Bismarck here says that he was a co-conspirator with Albert Pike, and he was the one instrumental in bringing about the First World War. Well, that's the First World War. Then he dreams that there must be, he is given in this visionary dream, a Second World War. Now remember, this was in 1925 that it became public in this book written by a cardinal from Santiago, Chile, Rodriguez. He says, quote, "The Second World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences between the fascists and the political Zionists. This war must be brought about so that Nazism is destroyed and that the political Zionism will be strong enough to institute a sovereign state of Israel in Palestine. During the Second World War, international communism must become strong enough in order to balance Christendom, which would then be restrained and held in check until the time when we would need it for the final social cataclysm." Well, there are some who may argue that the terms Nazism and Zionism were not known in 1871. Now, you should remember, however, that the Illuminati invented both of these movements. In addition, communism as an ideology and as a coined phrase originates in France during the Revolution. In 1785, Restif coined the phrase 4 years before the revolution broke out. Restif and Babeuf, in turn, were influenced by Rosé, as was the most famous conspirator of them all, Adam Weishaupt. Then he has this vision, in this vision, not only one world war and two world wars, but here comes the third world war. He says, and I quote, "The third world war must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences caused by the agents of the Illuminati between the political Zionists and the leaders of the Islamic world." Yeah, that's what he says. The war, this was 1925. Please understand that. At least 1925. May go all the way back to 1871, as is purported to do, but at least it was written in a book and published in 1925. So he says, after World War I was just over a few years, and before World War II even started, he's now thinking about this Third World War, and it says that it will be caused by the differences between the political Zionists and the leaders of the Islamic world. The war must be conducted in such a way that Islam, the Muslim Arabic world, and political Zionism, the State of Israel, mutually destroy each other. That's what it says. Meanwhile, the other nations, once more divided on this issue, will be constrained to fight to the point of complete physical, moral, spiritual, and economic exhaustion. We shall unleash the nihilists and the atheists, and we shall provoke a formidable social cataclysm in which, in all its horror, will show clearly to the nations the effect of absolute atheism, origin and savagery, and of the most bloody turmoil. So he's against Christianity and he's against atheism. They're supposed to fight each other to the death, you see. Then, he says, everywhere the citizens obliged to defend themselves against the world minority of revolutionaries will exterminate those destroyers of civilization and the multitude, disillusioned with Christianity, whose deistic spirits will from that moment be without compass or direction, anxious for an ideal, but without knowledge where to render its adoration, will receive the true light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer. That's what he says. Brought finally out in the public view. So he's saying that Lucifer will finally make himself, the good guy. He's going to save the world from these atheists who don't believe in deity and from these Christians who believe in the good God. Well, so it says, this manifestation will result in the general reactionary movement which will follow the destruction of Christianity and atheism, both conquered and exterminated at the same time. Well, I don't know if it's true, but I can tell you that it sure has played into what is being carried on in the Middle East today. And it looks like everything from World War I and World War II, with the development of the State of Israel, and with the Zionist movement and the communist movement and the atheist movement and the peppering down of persecution on the Christians of this world, it looks like that may be Lucifer's attempt at annihilation of us all, so that Lucifer will appear in the form, of course, of what the Bible calls the Antichrist, and establish peace on earth for mankind. I got news for all those Illuminatists. Their little plan will only last for 3.5 years and will be destroyed by the second coming of Jesus Christ himself, who, by the way, is going to take all of us Christians out of this world before the 7 years sets in, before this Luciferian ideal can capture the imaginations of people on planet Earth. There won't be a fight between Christianity and atheism, because we will be gone. But the atheists, they might meet their demise at the hands of the Antichrist when he introduces Lucifer, his old pal. I can tell you this, they're all going to be thrown into the lake of fire. So says the Word of God, and I believe it from cover to cover. I'm J.R. Church. We'll see you again tomorrow with our analysis of the news.